how do I even begin to explain George Washington?
George Washington is amazing.
He was the hero in the French and Indian War and the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army.
I hear you survived the harsh winter at Valley Forge.
One time he led us across the cold Delaware River.
It was breathtaking.
And everyone knew George Washington was going to be the first president of America.
The United States of America is filled with a rich history, including one of the most prominent figures that came about from our nation's birth, George Washington.
Born and raised in Virginia, George Washington grew up farming on his late father's plantation. He inherited the estate of Mount Vernon after his older half-brother's death. Before the French and Indian War, George Washington lived his life as a surveyor. He mapped out and established boundaries between towns and provinces.
After fighting in the French and Indian War and gaining national recognition for his efforts in the Revolutionary War, George Washington became a hero in the eyes of the colonists. His victories as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army from 1775 to 1783 only increased his popularity.
Washington had experienced the effects of increased taxes by the British and held the belief that it was in the best interest of the colonists to declare independence from England. Following the Revolutionary War, his leadership, character, and sense of justice allowed the people to trust and believe in him and to choose him as the first president of the United States.
Once elected into office, Washington set the precedent that would determine the way future presidents would think and act. He left a legacy as first president of the U.S. Some of his most notable contributions include the idea of forming an executive cabinet and the model that no president can serve more than 2 terms. The French and Indian War started in 1754. Washington joined to fight for the British Army. He had no previous military experience, but was made commander of the Virginia militia. When he was demoted to lieutenant colonel and became aware of the inequality with colonists and royal commissioners, he promptly resigned and went back to Mount Vernon.
As tensions increased between the colonists and the British, Washington became the Virginian delegate in the First and Second Continental Congress. From there, he was chosen as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army for the American Revolution after his great commanding skills were recognized in the French and Indian War.
George Washington impacted the greater war effort through his resilient leadership and victories. Under his command, the Continental Army found the strength to continue fighting, despite any setbacks and losses. He influenced the spirit and morale of colonists and soldiers, and kept the dream for independence strong. His passion for freedom opened the people's eyes as well as their chests. Without George Washington, who's to say we would have won the war?
In the Revolutionary War, George Washington was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He delegated his power to other small militias of the army and other commanders, which not only showed his humility to share power, but his leadership as well. Let's take a look at some of George Washington's most notable victories.
One such example was the winter at Valley Forge. In the winter of 1777 to 1778, the Continental Army barely had supplies such as food, clothing, and ammunition. The lack of organization in the army contributed in part to their suffering, but with Washington's leadership, the 12,000 soldiers pushed through their hardships and survived.
Washington's initiative led to some of his most famous victories, including the battles of Trenton and Yorktown. On December 26, 1776, George Washington and his forces crossed the cold Delaware River, where they attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. The crossing was later depicted in a well-known painting by German-American artist Emanuel Lutz. This surprise ambushed the Hessians, allowing Washington and his men to capture almost the whole force. This victory was the first major win of the Continental Army, which greatly increased the soldiers' morale.
The Battle of Yorktown was the biggest victory for the Continental Army, and under Washington's leadership, Cornwallis surrendered to General Washington on October 19, 1781.
The surrender of the British brought about the birth of a new nation of the United States of America.
In almost the month-long siege of Yorktown, the colonists were able to cut off the British troops with the help of the French allies, forcing Cornwallis to surrender.
The Battle of Yorktown was the last of the American Revolution, finally making way for the peace of negotiations between the colonials and the British.
6 years after the Revolutionary War ended, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. His legacy as president left people calling him one of the greatest founding fathers of the United States. He was aware that decisions he'd make in this position would set an example for future presidents. For example, he included politics from opposing parties.
Jefferson and Hamilton. As he thought it was a good idea to have different political views. And it wasn't.
What George Washington has done for our country has not gone unnoticed. Under his presidency, 5 new states joined the Union. These states were North Carolina, Rhode Island, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. In addition, you can find him on the dollar bill and quarter, and many places such as the state of Washington have been named in honor of him.
After 8 years of acting as president, George Washington resigned in 1797. His retirement was actually a blessing in disguise, as it determined that no president can serve more than 2 terms, which later became the 22nd Amendment of the Constitution in 1951. In addition, it saved the panic of a sudden death while in office, as George Washington died 2 years later in 1799.
Upon his death, Washington's will detailed the freedom of the slaves of Mount Vernon. Their freedom would be given at the death of his wife, Martha Washington, and would be supported by the Mount Vernon estate if they ever found themselves in need of it.
There is much speculation as to why George Washington never publicly spoke about his will nor the topic of slavery. However, his slaves' freedom brought about the birth of the idea of ending slavery as a whole.
The rise of George Washington influenced the future of the entire newborn nation, and without his achievements in military and politics, the United States of America might not be where it is today.